Okay, so we learned yesterday that if there is a one thing that surprised us, that you are allowed to plant a tree in your property, even if eventually the roots will protrude into your neighbor's property and potentially cause damage, let's say, to his pit. But there's some caveats there. Biram bamed varma murim ba'alma. That's in a
Rabbi.
normal situation. Aval im hanizak mishtamish b'chatzero tashmish kavua. But let's say the guy, the person who's the neighbor, who's got these roots growing into his property, has a fixed use for his property. Such that this is one of the primary functions. Let's say I got a swimming pool in my backyard. And there's no way for me to remedy the damage that's going to be caused by my friend's use and eventually his tree. Yeah. Even if the mazik is also using regular use of his backyard, al hamazik laharchik esatzmo. The mazik has to distance his source of damage.
Rabbi, can you share the screen, please?
Sorry about that, Chief. Okay. Yeah, I'm recording. V'chein kasher tashmish hamazik eno bichlal ikarei shimushim shadam mishtamesh b'chatzero o she'efshar levatlo. But, and similarly, if the mazik is using his property in a way that is not necessarily the way that he says it's not included in the primary uses of a property, and it's possible for him to no longer do that activity on his property. Im tashmisho denizik b'chatzero kavua, if the use of the neighbor, the nizik, the damaged party, is fixed, is something that is normal and regular. Rotzalomer shul bichlal ikarei shimushim shadam mishtamesh b'chatzero. Al hamazik laharchik et atzmo va'afilu im hanizik yochol letakin bekali nosel min hanezik. So then it's still incumbent upon the mazik to distance his source of damage, even if the nizik could easily remedy the problem. When we call, in other words, so there's multiple criteria on either side. You have to look at what is considered normative use. You have to look at how easy is it for me to protect myself from the damage, and then the third criterion is how. So first is normative. Is it normative or non-normative? Is it something that I can easily remedy for myself? So those are the two. I guess those are the two criteria. So in a situation where the mazik is doing normative use, but the nizik cannot easily remedy the damage, so then the nizik is in the right. If the mazik's use is non-normative and the nizik could easily distance himself from the damage or remedy the damage, so then the nizik is still within the right. When is the mazik in the right? When it's normative use and the nizik could easily distance himself or remedy the problem. I guess maybe the case of the well is where it's I could easily move the well to some other part of my property, I suppose. ומכל מקום בדיעבד שהזיק באחד משני אופנים הנ"ל פטור מלשלם כיוון שאינו אלא גרמה. But if ultimately, if damage is caused, then since it's only causative damage, where we talked about the planting of the tree, or the other case was where there's a hole that opens in the ceiling, and I'm not pouring water directly into the hole. So those two, which are causative and they happen gradually, so then the mazik is not, if he doesn't remedy the problem, he cannot be held liable. But lechatchila, he does have to remedy the problem. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Mamono shel adam hamazik bipshiyaso, which is the finances of a person who is mazik negligently. Kishem sha'adam ushar shelo lahazik chavero b'shimushav kinizkar b'seifim hakodmim v'afilu b'mamon shel acherim. Just like a person is commanded not to damage his friend in his normal everyday activities, kach musar adam al mamono shelo yazik b'pshiyaso b'ofanim hanal. A person has to make sure that anything that he owns, anything that is financially connected to him, also cannot be the cause of damage. Let's say a farm animal or something like that. Vafilu, or his dog. Vafilu lo nasnu sham biyadav klal. Even if he did not place that damage, the source of damage in that place. And we'll discuss this more later. Next, din shimushe adam shalula mahazik ba'atid lishcheno. The halacha of where a person is using his property in a normative way where damage could be caused. There's a potential for damage. So he says like this, Mutar la'adam li'ishtamesh b'shalo samuch l'meitzar, I think that l'meitzar shebeino uvein chaveiro, kasher ba'u ha'ishtamshut ein chavero nizuk mimenu klal. A person can use his property all the way up to his property line when the use of that property is not causing damage whatsoever. Afal pi shabayit ochatzer chavero asuya libanot ba'atid vehishtamshut hanal tazikenu. As he says, let's say it's possible for your neighbor to build on his property in such a way where your use could potentially cause him damage if he puts up that new structure. In other words, as long as I've established, the point of this halacha is, as long as I've established precedent on my property that I am using my property in such and such a way, you cannot stop me from that use if you decide to change the use of your property later on. So let's say I have, let's say, windows that look out into your property, and you want to put up a wing of your house where you, or let's say you want to put up a swimming pool where you want more privacy. So that's not something that you can compel me to do because I've already established precedent of being able to use my property in a certain way, which denies you a certain level of privacy on that spot on your property. Even though this may cause future damage, the person who established precedent never has to move his operation. Vahatam, and the reason is, Mishum de bishash shesamach batchila al kolpanim eno begeder mazik bechitzav. He says because at the time when he began his activities, he was not a mazik. Va'achshav kishniya davra nizok kvar kol ha'maaseh hamazik v'al kol panim eno begeder mazik bechitzav. And now, where the damage is now being caused because of the change of use, this person is no longer actively damaging. Seems to be the term that he's using. And when the neighbor now wants to build, it could be that at that point he will, let's see, it's not clear to me. It's not clear to me his language. I guess we'll have to get some examples. Oh, I guess what it means is that when the neighbor wants to build, he'll have to make sure that the guy who was there first is not being damaged as a result of his new structure. Okay. Yeah.
This is based on the fact that whatever was there before can't be moved to somewhere else.
No, even if it could be moved, but it comes at great expense, you know.
But in the case of the well, it's okay, even if the person had the choice to move the well somewhere else.
Correct. In the case of the well, the reason why the mazik is not liable and is allowed to do that is because it's a slow growing damage that may take years. And during that interim, if there is anything, and it's a use that could be easily moved to somewhere else on the guy's property.
So let's say that instead of a building, you have a fire pit that you always burn your whatever, rubbish, whatever it is, on the corner, and somebody wants to build at that point.
And it's going to create smoke
but you have a precedent that's where your fireplace is always been.
So we're just learning the general rules. These are you're asking these are all good questions. I'm hoping he's going to give us specific cases as we move forward. This is just the first chapter where he's giving us the general pratim. So he says Bamed dvarim amurim ba'alma. Aval ba'ofen de tashmisho de mazik b'chatzero eno me'ikarei shimushim shadam mishtamesh b'chatzero. And here again, he throws in this proviso that it's a normative use of the property. But if it's not one of the normative or primary uses of the property, kidimaso shel mazik eno mo'ila she'yuchal lahamshich li'ishtamesh kasher nizok chavero la'achar zeh. Then we can coerce the fellow who's the source of damage to stop doing what he's doing once I want to put up my structure, right? Once I want to build or do that activity on my property, then if the guy's activity is not as a non-normative or non-primary use of his property, then we can coerce him. V'hu hadin kasher tashmisho mazik ba'ashan oreach beisakise o nidnud binyano shel nizak. And the same thing would be true is if the use of the mazik, the type of damage it's causing, is either smoke, that was your case, Doug, or let's say foul odor. Let's say a guy has set up an outhouse on that side, on that part of the property. And previously, it didn't bother me because it was sufficiently far from my house, but now I'm building a back house, and now your outhouse is bothering my back house. Onidnud binyano shel nizik. Or let's say
before they get a hotel.
Yeah, or let's say nidnud binyano shel nizik. Or let's say the activity that you're doing on your property is creating vibrations. And whereas because I haven't built anything there yet in my property, the vibrations are tolerable. But now that I'm going to be putting up a structure, your vibrations could potentially cause damage.
Not good vibrations.
Yeah, they're not good. The chayotze menezikim she'ein hada'as sovlasan. In other words, any other kind of damage where we would not expect a person to tolerate that coming into his property. O behezek re'iyah kegon al yidei shepasach chalon shechashuv kemazik biyadayim v'chayotze. Or let's say what I had mentioned before, let's say a guy has on his property a window that opens up into his neighbor's property. Well, right now, the neighbor's not using that part of his property, so it doesn't bother him. But now that he's going to be putting something up on his property that could potentially, like a swimming pool or whatever, Osha Tashmisho Denizik Bachatzero Umeikarei Shimushim Shadam Ishtamesh Bachatzero V'ef Shalo Letakin Bekal Shalo Yinazek. So he says, so in a situation where the mazik's use is non-normative and non-primary, or when the use of the nizik is something which is considered primary and cannot be moved to anywhere else, and he has no way of remedying the problem on his property, so then we can compel the mazik to change his operations. Uvechol ofanim hanal, lo rak bishat hanezek tzarich laharchik tashmishav, ela gam mitchila yachol chaver limchos bo b'tainu shekasher yinazek And furthermore, the neighbor who is about to build something on his property, which is going to now be the source of damage through the use of your property, can actually file an injunction to prevent you from doing that activity even before the damage is caused. In other words, he says, I don't want to have to take you to Beis Din after your damage is already after it's already occurred. I know it's going to occur because the vibrations you're causing or the outhouse that you have over there is just going to be a problem for me. So I can compel you to stop it even before I put up my new use on my property. Va'afilu im hamazik rotza lichtov lo shtar hoda'a bekach ein shomin lo mishum denimtza hanizik tzarich lishmor shtaro min ha'achbarim. And even if the mazik says, I commit to, once you start building, I will remove the outhouse. The nizik, the neighbor can say, no, that's not good enough. I want you to move it now. In other words, and the reason is because what if I lose that paper? I'm not interested in having to hold on to that paper with the commitment for that time because I may lose it. So I want you to get to work right away.
Seems contradictory to what he said before. It sounded like before, if there's no damage at the time.
So he says, so it depends. So remember, there are two criteria that he's working with. The two caveats are, is it normative or non-normative? And number two, can I easily protect myself from that damage? So those are two criteria that where we give the advantage to the injured party. So if his use is non-normative, so we can coerce him. Or if my use is something that is normative and cannot easily be protected from the mazik, so then that also is will give the nizik the upper hand.
Then you don't invoke the who came first.
That's right. That's correct. Okay. V'chein im hasomech mazik lechavero be'etz michato. Let's say the mazik is causing active damage while he's just beginning his adjacent activity. Kagon shebo lachpor bor samach lemeitzer chavero shebechol maka umaka shenosin bekarka mirapa hu karka chavero umafsid chozek yesodos bor she'osi chavero lasos bechatzero eno somech klal shehu kemazik bechitzav. Another example would be is if let's say I want to dig a pit on my property, but with every blow of the chisel or whatever I'm using to break through the hard rock or whatever it is, or the soil, I'm causing a softening of my friend's property, a loosening and a dislodging of my friend's soil, such that if he were to want to build on his property, he would not be able to, because now I've caused some kind of geological insecurity on his property as a result of my digging. So then I'm not allowed to do it, even if my friend hasn't yet built anything. He says it's only when it's only when, let me just see. It's only when there's no expectation of the neighbor to do anything that would be the source of damage, that would be damaged. It's only when it's extremely unlikely, after consulting, I guess, with the neighbor, are you planning on doing any construction on this part of the property? And he says no, then I would be allowed to dig, provided, even if that's going to be loosening the stability of his soil. And therefore, even if the friend changes his mind afterwards, then he doesn't have to change his operations. And when his friend wants to build, then the language is very unclear here. Okay. It's really unclear which party has to move. So I'm hoping that we'll get some further clarity. He says, Kol hanal hu kasher hanizak yachid, aval im harabim nizokim harei asomich b'cholofen tzorach liistalek. Everything that's been set up until now is when we're dealing with two private parties. But if my activity on my private party causes potential damage to a public thoroughfare that's adjacent to me, then even if I was there first, and even if it's a slow growing damage, I have an obligation to distance my whatever is on my property that's causing the damage to the public thoroughfare. He says, but if my activity was there first, and I was completely within my rights to do that activity on my property, and the public thoroughfare came afterwards, even though the public can coerce me to stop that activity, I can still demand payment from them in order to make me whole, in order to move my operation somewhere else. So let's say in other words, it's conceivable, let's say that a guy runs some kind of very smelly operation on his property. Let's say, he makes
Waste collection.
Yeah, it could be waste collection. It could be like he manufactures something that either tannery or something that causes a great smell. And he's completely within his right because behind his property there's just cornfields, right? And then all of a sudden they start putting up this major road and a mall or whatever it is behind his property, and all of the developers saying, you got to stop this. Yeah. So they can demand that the guy move his operations, but then he would be entitled to compensation for the costs of moving the property. Okay, next. Din harchakat nezikin ben mocher velokeach shalokach mimenu bayis o chatzer hasamach lo v'din harchakas nezikin ben shchenim shekanu batim o chatzeros b'zeh achar zeh mibal habayit echad. What will be the obligation as far as distancing a source of damage when it's a buyer and seller involved? Let's say I purchase a house from you that's adjacent to your property, and on your property there's a source of damage, but I bought my property from you. Or let's say two neighbors purchased a subdivision. In other words, two neighbors purchased properties from one seller. Does that change the halacha? So, hamocher bayis o chatzer hasamach lebeisa o chatzero, tzorach lizoher klapi habayis o hachatzer shemochar b'chol dini harchakos nezikin shenisbaru la'el. If a person sells off a field or a house that is adjacent to his house, so let's say I have a large piece of property and I build another house on my property and then I sell it off. I have to be very careful regarding the property that I've sold to distance any source of damage to my new neighbor. V'lo od ela dekeven shemocher be'ayin yafe mocher, rashai halokeach lishtamish b'shalo gam ba'ofen shemafil al hamocher. And furthermore, when it comes to, let's say, shadow laws, right? There's a term for it, I forget what it is, where I'm not allowed to, if I put up a new property, I have to make sure that I don't deprive you of sunlight.
Cast the shadow.
Yeah.
The shadow.
I forget, yes. But if I'm buying the property from you and you're my neighbor, there's an assumption that you're giving me permission to build on that property, even if it's going to cause you some blockage of sunlight. livnot kir toch arba amos l'chalonosav. In other words, let's say you have your house on your property and you've spun off a portion of your property and sold it to me. There's an assumption that you're granting me tacitly permission to put up a wall to divide between our properties, even if that wall is going to cause you some obstruction. Okay? Even though I put up those windows completely, it was completely fine for me to put up those windows because you didn't exist yet on that property. But even though I was there first, it's assumed that the fact that I'm selling you that property, it means that I'm giving you permission to put up a wall that's going to block my view. V'yesh omrim dahainu davka im enu mafil olav legamre, aval ba'ofen she'mafil olav legamre kagon she'en lo or mitzad acher klal aser, ve'en omrim bazeh mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. However, there are those who opine that there can't be full obstruction. In other words, if the wall goes mamish right up to my windows, so then that's not what I sold you the property for. There has to be some minimal amount of sunlight and air that comes into my property such that it's not a complete obstruction. It can be a partial obstruction, but not a complete obstruction. V'yesh omrim da'afilu mafil of legamre mutar, democher ba'ayin yafa mocher. However, there are those who say that even if it's a complete obstruction, it's assumed that because I sold the property to you, I'm giving you permission to do whatever you want on that property, unless it's specified otherwise in some kind of agreement. And the Ramah says, the halokeach yachol lidrosh me'amocher listom chalonosav. The Ramah goes so far as to say that a person has the right to demand of the seller that he seal off his windows that look right into his newly purchased property. Ulam das maran zal de'enu yachol lidrosh kein. However, the Mechaber says you can't do that. V'chein kol kayotze mishimushe halokeach shemonim shimushe hamocher. And the same thing would be true that when a person sells the property to a new neighbor, it's assumed that he's giving the new neighbor full rights to obstruct or to do whatever he wants on his property, even if it's going to in some way compromise my use of my property. Because the fact that you sold it means that you are willing to take the money and give up certain benefits that you previously had. Only activities that are directly causing damage to the seller, that the seller did not mean to give over to the buyer. So let's say a person has a house and he has a field, and he has windows in his house that open up into the field. And he sells the house and he keeps the field for himself. So there, it's just the opposite case. The seller who just kept the field is allowed to build a wall to obstruct the view of the buyer who bought his house with windows. Okay, we'll skip the brackets. V'yesh omrim, the kaven shemocher ba'ayin yafa mocher, mutar lokech lishtamish b'shalo gam kishemaziko, uvilvad she'eno biyadayim mamash. And some say that when a person sells his property to a buyer, he sells it with full rights of use, without any holds barred, and therefore the buyer can use his property for whatever he wants, even if it is indirectly causing damage, as long as it's not actively damaging the other person's property. What's the example? V'lachein hachofer bor b'toch sadehu samuch le'emtzeito. So therefore, if a guy's A guy is digging a well right in the center of his property. And then he sells half of his field. And now the buyer wants to dig a well as well. But with every dig, he's weakening the soil on the seller's property. So he has to distance his digging sufficiently that it won't cause damage. Which would be 6 tvachim. Because the seller had his well there first. And we don't say that the seller was selling with full permission to do whatever you want, because this is an active damage that is causing damage on a constant basis. So there's a lot of details, but let me just see where this is all taking us. Okay, we'll finish the chapter Mirz Hashem tomorrow, and then we'll go on to the next one. Okay, have a great day, everybody.